aerospace and defense manufacturing,
machines and automation,
additive manufacturing,
smart manufacturing,
global manufacturing economy.
Welcome to Advanced Manufacturing Now, the podcast for manufacturing professionals, powered by SME. From the design screen to the shop floor to final assembly, we drive the conversation about making manufacturing smarter by connecting people who are passionate about manufacturing.
Hello and welcome to Advanced Manufacturing Now, the podcast for manufacturing professionals. Don't forget to like and subscribe to get new episodes delivered to your feed each week. I'm David Muller, Senior Editor at SME Media, and I'll be your host today. And today we're joined by Ron Crabtree, CEO of MetaExperts and MetaOps. With more than 30 years in the industry, Ron has seen quite a bit, from streamlining healthcare systems to revamping automotive assembly lines. He's got a toolbox full of experience in operational leadership and digital transformation, and he knows how to leverage those across a wide range of industries. Ron, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to join you.
Hey, I gave a little brief overview there, but maybe if you don't mind, we could start by just kind of giving a little bit more about yourself, talk a little bit more about yourself and MetaOps and MetaExperts and kind of what it's all about.
Yeah, great. I've been in and around manufacturing for, I don't like to admit it, more than 40 years now. Actually went into manufacturing directly out of high school, assembling travel trailers of all things, and then ended up working for a corrugated box manufacturer and out on a shop floor as a union worker, and then got a little break to get into the office and learn how to do production scheduling and for, the corrugated plant. And that led me to, moving up the food chain pretty quickly. We moved to California back in 1978. I ended up working for Disney's manufacturing division called MAPO, which is where they design and build all the audio animation, say that fast 5 times. Animatronics, I should say, animated figures, track vehicles, ride control systems, everything mechanical, and for the show support for all the Disney attractions. And they were ramping up for Epcot and Tokyo Disneyland at the time. So I got a nice ride of learning the best practices at Disney, and including program evaluation, the review technique, and how that's applied in a manufacturing setting. And we moved back to Michigan. I moved into the automotive industry, worked in the automotive supply chain for many years as a materials manager, plant manager, and ended up moving to Detroit with United Technologies Automotive to work in corporate purchasing. We were doing target and Kaizen costing back in 1996. And then ended up being recruited out to have full P&L for a manufacturing Tier 1 supplier to Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. Moved into consulting back in 98, 99 timeframe with Grant Thornton in their Detroit office. And they found out I'd implemented ERP systems several times, so I became their Oracle practice leader and subject matter expert in Oracle demand flow and led major Oracle implementations. And then my last stop in working for the man, if you will, was with RWD Technologies. They had the world's largest lean manufacturing practice at the time, centered in Detroit. We were doing accelerated lean deployment support at Ford Motor Company. So I got to work closely with a lot of ex-Toyota people on the best practices Toyota brought to the party. We were doing detailed value stream mapping, activity-based costing studies at Ford assembly plants, and backing out what all the opportunities were just within the plant 4 walls at Ford plants here in the United States. Of course, really enjoyed that and ended up starting MetaOps in 2002. We were incorporated, and initially we were doing management consulting and Lean Six Sigma and supply chain. And golly, back in 2011, after many requests from customers, we came up with MetaExperts as an interim talent solution for expert people like me that can step in at a moment's notice to help solve difficult business problems. So I've been doing that pretty heavily now. We're up to like 1,200 certified MetaExperts in the network now. And I also have my own podcast, involved a lot of thought leadership stuff, helped develop many university online programs and Lean Six Sigma, digital transformation, etc. So anything about, how do we operate better in manufacturing? That's kind of been my passion for more than 40 years now.
Wow, excellent. I saw obviously, and I included in the bio of the automotive and healthcare experience, but that Disney animatronics I didn't have on my bingo card. That's it. I mean, they got to be built somewhere too, and they got to be assembled. So that's an interesting piece of history there. A piece of your bio. Are you from Michigan originally?
Yeah, I grew up in Western Michigan where we reside near Kalamazoo.
Yeah, so the auto industry obviously is huge here, huge in the state. It sounds like you've had quite a bit of experience there, but now you've expanded the network. You mentioned to some 1,200 experts. I mean, you all span, I would assume, a variety of different sectors at this point.
Yeah, anybody involved with making and moving stuff, right? So manufacturing all flavors, distribution, we've done work with some large retail firms like the Gap, for example. So, if you're involved with moving and handling stuff, that's kind of our sweet spot.
Okay, and what do thinking just from your perspective, thinking about small and medium-sized manufacturers? It's a lot of our listeners are small, medium-sized manufacturers. What do you see from your vantage point as some of the biggest challenges facing them right now?
Well, there's really three things that, well, actually there's four, okay? But the first is digital transformation and the digitization of work. All the rage out there is artificial intelligence is supposed to solve all of our problems, and we'll talk more about that later. The second phenomenon, and small businesses certainly are a victim to this, is what's called the forever labor shortage. And the U.S. Department of one of the U.S. departments in economics, they published some data showing that the growth of the North American workforce has been decreasing every year for the last 40 years, and that trend's going to continue. So there's this real problem with lack of arms and legs at all levels to get things done. And of course, there's this endless pressure to do more with less. The application of Lean Six Sigma, operational excellence, all that comes into play. And then kind of right behind that, you've got the ongoing supply chain malaise that continues, right? So, and all of those overlay to create a great deal of uncertainty going into 2025 with all these changes in trade policies on top of everything else.
That it seems pretty overwhelming. So where do you start then? I mean, if you're a small or medium-sized manufacturer, you want to increase productivity, you want to increase efficiency. I mean, no, having said all of that, like how do I be less overwhelmed as a small or medium-sized manufacturer?
Well, I think probably the simplest answer to that is you got to stop for a couple of minutes and think about what is it you need to do better or differently. Or, my buddy Jim Gitney, he published a really cool book called Strategy Realized, The Business Hierarchy of Needs, and how to turn strategy into results. He was actually a guest in my Metapod podcast last year. And one of the things he advocates, and this is what I would suggest to a small business, is start with getting really clear about your most important goal, right? Just what is it? And then subordinate what you're going to focus on improving or changing out around that important goal. So for the sake of discussion, if it's growth, you have to understand what's stopping you from growing and then attack the things that will allow you to improve your growth, right? If it's becoming more efficient, right, reducing your cost basis because you can't control the prices, but you know that you can sell a lot more at a lower price, that's where, Lean Six Sigma and those techniques come into play. So it's a moving target how to answer that, but I would advocate, if you're not really clear about your most important objective and then subjugating the key activities to helping you drive to that, then that's going to be a problem.
And what do you mentioned workforce. This is something that's a recurring theme on this podcast, just because, like you said, or like you alluded to, I mean, there's just sheer numbers. There's people leaving the workforce. They're taking institutional knowledge with them. There's not as much people entering the workforce, at least in manufacturing. What can companies do to create smart manufacturing workforces, maybe through strategic training and development? What are some ideas there?
Well, as it happens, I talked about the forever labor shortage. We're actually in the process of building out a benchmarking survey to identify all the things organizations can do to deal with this forever labor shortage problem. So far, we've got like 65 different possible things you can do to cope with the forever labor shortage problem. So, you talk about being an employer of choice, there's like 23, 24 different actions you should consider. And in there is, what about development of the workforce? So coming right behind that is this thing that's called workforce strategy or workforce development strategies, right? And under that, you've got several things that you have to really give some careful thought to. There's, do you want to look at, immigration assistance? Do you want to look at virtual workforce support programs? You can employ people anywhere to do the work you need to have done. Do you want to tap into veterans recruiting and support? So there's Lots of different things you can do there, or public-private partnerships around, is there money out there so we could tap into the K through 12 system and begin, aiming children toward the kinds of jobs we have in our companies going down the road. And there's cool stuff out there like, inner city training programs to teach German trades to disadvantaged young people in the inner cities. That's an initiative I found pretty interesting. So the key thing here is to get really clear about A, what's your most important goal? What do we need to actually be better at in the next few years? And then backing down into what are the gaps going to be? And then backing from that into, okay, what's our best strategies to develop that future workforce? And that's, again, going to be quite dependent on the industry, the geography you're in, the basis of competition, and the kinds of things that differentiate your company and really set you apart from competition. That's where you've got to focus on developing that future workforce, is having the people and the capabilities to deliver on what's unique, different, or better about your company.
Yeah, so it'll obviously, like you said, it'll really vary from company to company depending on what their needs are and what their industry is and their geography. One thing we're hearing about across pretty much all sectors, industries, is the increase in automation and how it could at least partially offset some of the worker shortage. There's different shops, especially when you get in the small, medium size, there's different levels of automation. Some are maybe still in the early 20th century, and some are, way ahead with it, like everything, all their processes, automated and that kind of thing. What are your thoughts and just humans effectively working with automation when it comes to supply chain operations? I mean, what's a good balance look like in your eyes here?
Well, something I heard recently, I can't remember exactly what the source was, and they were having this argument about artificial intelligence, whether we should be leveraging that. And one of the things that kind of fell out of that is basically artificial intelligence plus people, right? People working using AI, leveraging AI will outperform or beat people not using AI or leveraging technologies, right? So I think that's just a crucial thing of, recognizing that it is something we have to embrace, but it's crucial that we integrate people with it. So if we zero in on supply chain and just talk about supply chain operations, I had Derek Browning with Uber Freight join me on my podcast, and he was talking a lot about how we leverage AI in logistics. And the example he used I thought was fantastic is, you think in logistics, you would think that would be highly, amenable to automation, but there's a limit. When you're in the firing line, deciding how that particular, pallet of freight's going to be picked up, who's going to move it on the fly with all the moving parts, you can't really trust AI to make the right decision, right? There's just no way to really model that. But what you can do is use AI to actually come up with the possible solutions and quickly work down through the cost benefit of each one, and then do some background checking on capacity, and that's in that stream, and then informing the human being to make that intelligent choice about, instead of spending 30 minutes researching which carrier or mode I should use to get that LTL moved, I can let AI kind of present me with those 5 or 6 options that are best, that optimize with the choices I've set it up for, and then use the human brain to make that final judgment call. So that's a great example. We think about procurement, and this is probably more applicable in bigger companies, but one of our partners is Orchestral Software, and they've been very successful at automating a lot of the procurement process. And, one of the things that's horribly time-consuming for people is to work down through all the things you need to do to identify the vendors that we can invite to quote something for us, and then providing the information to them, then getting those back and analyzing those, making sense of them. Well, in this case, Orchestral's got a solution using AI and gaming theory that allows them to capture out of the ERP system transactional data. They've got this massive database of suppliers and potential sources for a particular item, and they're able to create, if you will, a reverse market, but then handle a lot of the communication and even suggested price points back to suppliers. And that way you can engage literally hundreds of suppliers taking a look at a particular spend, and then boil all that down to something that the procurement team can use then to pick the best pricing models. And yeah, of course, you're going to want to drive cost out. That's why we would do something like that. But then what about other challenges we have to deal with? For example, with tariffs, what risk am I taking on from a tariff perspective, making this decision with that supply chain? And what about the suppliers? And are we going to be taking on some risk associated with that? What about ESG, right? Environmental, social, and governance. Do we have mandates or things we have to be cognizant of? Or if we're trying to sell into the European market, for example, we have to prove that we're compliant with those kinds of standards. Well, that's where automation can be really powerful because that can be modeled and then fed back to the human beings for decision support pretty darn efficiently. So I see it, kind of this balance, right? I think it's really situational, right? AI is not an end-all solution. It's picking the right human interface points, right? Kind of getting me back to that, which mode carrier or provider should pick up that particular pallet of freight. AI can do the research, boil it out, but really we need a human being to make that last judgment call.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, that spans so many different industries too. Not even, I mean, even outside of manufacturing, people think, oh, AI is coming for our jobs. It's going to come do everything that we do. But no, where it's at least right now, like you said, it's helping to make better, quicker decisions a lot of times. As long as the data is good, that underpins things like you had mentioned, like underpinning the different logistics and things like that, then it can more quickly inform you for you to make the decision, for the human to make the decision. But is there a variety of software? Some of you talked about some of the logistics and some of the procurement decision, even some of the regulation, which is something we've talked about here before, especially with in different manufacturing operations, having automation, be able to make sure that you're not running afoul of different regulations in different countries, that kind of thing. But are there software solutions for like logistics and things like that? Is there a variety of stuff out there, or is it kind of something that you kind of maybe have to build on your own a little bit?
There is, and if you're a small manufacturer, a smaller company, you can't afford to go out and hire somebody with those kinds of skills, nor can you afford to, purchase a big platform like Orchestro. So in those cases, you might be better served to find a service provider. In effect, can you find a way to do some business process outsourcing for the stuff that you're not good at, nor do you have the time and the capability to build that? There's a lot of organizations out there that are offering, I'll call it services as soft service as a service. How do you say that right? So you have SaaS, software as a service. So this would be automation as a service, right? And that's what I would advocate is there's some choices for you. And these organizations tend to emerge based on certain industries and then certain functions, right? So if there's an industry you're in, then inside of that, there's going to be providers that are pretty good at the stuff involved with that industry. Or if it's a particular function, like, recruiting or something like that, then there's lots of choices there to leverage AI and other automation tools to speed up the recruiting process, for example.
Yeah. There's a lot of different things that it can start to really augment work-ons at this point. I mean, do you see any areas where automation is basically taking over tasks? AI or automation? I mean, from your vantage point, so far, I mean, because I see a lot of it of augmentation, but I don't see it replacing different tasks yet necessarily.
Yeah, that's there's a lot of moving pieces to answering that question, right? I think that it depends on the nature of the work that's being done. If it's highly transactional and repetitive, and there's information available from various sources to build models, that's where the automation can really pay off. But that breaks down pretty quickly when you're out on the factory floor, for example, dealing with a part that doesn't go together. You're not going to automate a solution for that. That's going to mean, that means some moving pieces to it. And I would advocate that if you're trying to figure out where to prioritize automation, then you have to really get a handle on your processes, right? And I like D. Edwards Deming, right, the great father of quality. One of the things he said that I thought was very applicable in this situation is if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. And then behind that, you have to kind of pull in this old tool that we're all familiar with in the lean lexicon called value stream mapping. And I would advocate that any business of any size has to get really clear about where do my people spend their time and their money? Where am I spending my money on people and people's activities? And what is it they're actually doing? And if you like, I can share a story, of an organization that I led through that process. If you'd like, I can share a quick story how that worked.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, please.
So this is an organization that makes buildings. Think about a custom designed building they're going to stand up on a site in the field. You could be storing stuff in it. Might be for It might be for storing dangerous, chemicals, stuff like this. Maybe it's storing your like a rental storage place and things like that. So they got to go through a lot of steps to quote, and they have to be compliant with the zoning requirements, the building requirements in a particular geography, city, state, based on all those requirements. And they had this real challenge of, the most important goal was to grow, right? They're an ESOP company and they're looking to continue to grow the business, but they kept running up against this wall that it was taking way too long to generate production-ready drawings. And it was taking way too much time, right? They couldn't find and hire enough engineers to keep up with the growth. So the project was to do a detailed value stream map of all the activities right from the first call with the customer all the way down to the engineers produce production-ready drawings so you can start the supply chain and get it into the plan for manufacturing. So we're just focusing in on the front-end part because that was the constraint. And we mapped all the different systems and touches that came into play along with the activities. And we learned that the sales team, we took in CRM and all the various tools and data sources, had 23 different systems and sources of information they might work with. The engineering team had 26. So we had like almost 50 different kinds of interfaces people were making with systems and technologies for the information to do their work. And through the value stream mapping activity, we were able to capture how long is it taking for a human being to do that? What kind of delay times associated with that? What's the first time quality capability at the step level? In other words, what percentage of the time can it be one and done? What percentage of the time do I have to loop out back to the customer, to another group, or go look at a secondary source of information? And we're able to map that and then do a Pareto analysis, the old 80-20 rule, and we were able to identify the 20% of the steps that were consuming roughly 80% of the resources, the 20% of the steps that were creating most of the rework, and they had some massive ahas. And one of the big ahas is that the sales team would hurry up and push stuff into engineering, thinking they had to hurry up and get it in there so we could start the process, with the unintended consequence of tons of rework and loopbacks to solve for missing information, incorrect information. The other thing is the problem is, particularly in the building industry, when you're getting permits and stuff like that, that information has a shelf life. And if it's good today, doesn't mean it's going to be good a month from now. You have to go back and start over, right, to get your permitting refreshed. So there were a lot of moving pieces, but the big ahas were, okay, we can't be working with nearly 50 data sources to do this. We got to consolidate that. And the other thing that was very interesting is they discovered through some careful integration of their product data management system into the CRM, and then retooling the sales force to be able to make better informed engineering type decisions very early in the sales cycle to guide the customer behavior was a huge payoff. Both in time, because the speed of that process had to speed up so that they could grow, and in terms of effort required to get to a good design. And they were able to find 35 to 40% opportunity there, but they had to retool. This led them to their workforce development strategy. They're saying, okay, we got to rethink what the salespeople actually do and basically move engineering capability way upstream to the beginning of the process, and then controlling the outputs so that we wouldn't produce outputs that later would create rework mistakes and loopbacks. So that allowed them to become very focused, right? So when you think about digital transformation, there's 30 different things you might do, and there's probably 3 or 4 that you can do in the short interval that will give you the biggest bang for the buck. And that's what they're able to do, is to really get precise and very surgical about where they're going to apply different forms of automation and integration differently for their future state.
And, we kind of touched on this earlier, but I'm wondering, and, I know, again, it depends sector to sector, company to company, but for manufacturers that are really far behind in digitization and in smart technologies and being able to use software to make, informed decisions, where should they start? Where should they go about getting started in this area?
Well, I call it kind of a death by 1,000 cuts, right? So digital transformation isn't like, implementing an ERP system that's a big bang and suddenly, we're a transformed business. I see it as lots of incremental surgical things you need to do. So I would kind of start with, do we have our most important goals? Have we broken that down to specifically which processes need to change? Have we broken that down to inside those processes where we need to improve our performance? And if you can't do that, then you're going to struggle, right? So you've got to have that kind of intel driving you to what to focus on. And then after that, what I've learned is that digital transformation is a moving target. I mean, we did a very deep, intense program for, a global e-learning company back in 2020. And, just go 5 years later, now it's early in 2025 now, a lot has changed, right? A lot's still there. There was a lot of greenfield learnings there, but then things are moving and changing. So I would advocate that be very surgical, but then challenge your technology provider, challenge your team that if I can't see a tangible business result and a real bottom line benefit inside 90 days, I should question why we're even doing it. And the reason I say that is A, it's really hard to stay focused for more than 90 days. And B, everything changes so quickly. And the only constant in business is change, and it's accelerating. It's getting worse. So I would advocate very surgical, but make sure you're doing that in short sprints that actually produce a desired result. And if you can't, take a new technology and get it through to the actual payoff, at least in a lab or a microcosm with a particular product line or a particular area, if you can't do that, question why you're doing it, because you're probably never going to be successful. In fact, the statistics are scary. All the big consulting companies are doing studies arguing that as much as 80 to 90% of digitization efforts fail outright or never really deliver the goods. So you got to protect yourself from that. So I would advise being very surgical, super clear about why we're doing it, what the business benefit is, how it supports our most important goal. And then if you can't get to the finish line with at least a proof of concept inside 90 days, push back. You shouldn't be doing it.
Kind of on the flip side of that, you had mentioned a CRM when you were talking about that one particular customer. It reminded me of actually automotive retail, which I used to be involved with automotive retail. And one of the things that sometimes certain retailers would run into is they'd actually have too many different technology vendors doing too many different things. I'm wondering, is that something that you see in manufacturing?
Yeah, you can. And that's why, having a steerco of some kind, right, that's connected with your chief technology officer, CIO, whatever that role might be. But you've got to create some kind of a steerco that's adequately represented in the business. So, the CEO's got to have visibility into that. But we've got to make sure that we're not operating in a vacuum in the decision making and that we're making balanced decisions around where to focus. So I think you've got to really understand the true business benefit and how that's going to roll up. But then doing it needs to be highly collaborative and engaging the various functions. Because if we're trying to just focus in on a function or a activity, one single activity, we might be sub-optimizing the whole.
I want to go back to one other thing you mentioned. At least, at the time that we're recording this, there's still a lot of uncertainty on tariffs. Is there any common thing that you can, is there anything that any advice that you can give around that at this point for those that might be affected by the uncertainty of what's going to happen with tariffs? And I would maybe kind of keep it broad if we can, but it's still that it itself is still a moving target, but you brought it up and I'd be remiss not to ask about it.
Yeah. In fact, I just recorded a podcast about that very topic here earlier this week. And at the end of that one, talked about at the end of the day, you've got to have the data and the information to be able to adequately model the impact of change A, B, C, D, or E, right? So if this tariff happens, which of our suppliers is that going to impact? Which part numbers? How much volume does that represent to us? And we have to be able to model the worst, best, and likely case scenarios and prepare our business to cope with the worst case. In other words, if it's going to put us out of business, then we better be ready for that. But basically have thought through what can we do to react to a worst case scenario? But we have to have the data to prove that, right? So for example, if it's 50% of our spend, that is a really big deal, right? If it's 10% of our spend, then we've got a little more latitude, right? And if it's a situation where we know it's going to happen and it's going to create a real problem with competition, that's when you have to start thinking, oh, wait a minute, maybe we need to be going back to our design folks and saying, okay, for new products and services we're developing, we shouldn't allow engineering to source whatever they want. We've got to get purchasing involved with that, right? The visibility to which suppliers and what parts of the world we're going to get the material or the goods from to fulfill that. We have to understand that. We might have to change, right? If we're trying to sell into Europe, for example, we might find out that we can't be compliant, and we have to know that stuff. So we have to be able to model that, understand worst and best case scenario, be prepared for the worst, and then design future state for the best case. And that's where, if I come back, I think about, our orchestra and what they're capable of doing. One of the things that can be modeled is if you're going to say, you know what, I'm going to get killed in this particular area of components, it's going to be a 10% hit to our top line growth, or 10% hit to our profits, or whatever. We got to find tools to very quickly identify the alternative resources, the alternative suppliers, places of supply, model that, and then really understand whether or not we can even make a move there. And if we can, be prepared to do that. So kind of a long-winded answer to a simple question.
No, but I mean, it's obviously that there's no time like the present to get prepared and to tease out different scenarios and different models and different ways you're going to react. And like you said, it would depend on what's being put on what, how much it's going to cost you per particular, whatever aspect of your business. But appreciate that. So great. Now tell us about, you have your own podcast called Metapod. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we launched that last year. Initially, we're kind of focused in on the three common challenges that people involved with tangible goods are involved with. And I mentioned this at the onset of this recording, right? It's the forever labor shortage, digitization, digital transformation of work, and endless pressure to do more with less, right? Just having to do more with less. So it's a platform for thought leaders to come together, our customers, our partners, some of our meta experts that come in and share some gems around, okay, should we diagnose for? And what are the top three things they think we should look at? And they get to pick one or three of those problems, or all three, and then diagnose and help the audience understand, how do I determine the opportunity or the threat associated with that diagnostic? And then we pivot on the back half of it to discuss, okay, if that's a problem, what do we do? What's the practical sage advice around solving those kinds of problems?
Cool. Okay, great. Well, hey, Ron, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us on our podcast. It was great talking with you today.
Yeah, it was an honor to be with you. Thank you.
If listeners want to learn more about MetaOps and Meta Experts, where should they go?
Well, just go to MetaExperts.com. And by the way, we have registered trademark on MetaOps and Meta Experts. We were there long before the new Meta got out there, right? But Meta Experts, or just the word Meta and the word experts, changed to MetaExperts.com. There's a button right there to learn, to watch some of the podcast episodes. Get in touch with me if you'd like me to be a speaker, if you're interested in learning more about talent. And that's the great place to start. I'm in LinkedIn, of course. Join my many, many thousands of connections and followers. And then my email is rcrabtree@metaops.com.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. And to learn more about the latest manufacturing trends and to hear more of our podcasts, don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast feed. And to stay up to date about what's happening in manufacturing today and hear more podcasts, visit us at advancedmanufacturing.org.